Greetings, this is Greg. At first glance, this World War II Japanese aircraft looks like a sleek, powerful fighter. It's not. This is the Nakajima Ki-115, a purpose-built kamikaze suicide attack airplane. We all know that during the later stages of the Second World War, the Japanese resorted to suicide attacks in an attempt to stop the ever-advancing U.S. forces. These suicide or kamikaze attacks were sometimes successful, but nowhere nearly successful enough to stop or even significantly slow the advance of U.S. forces. With the pending U.S. invasion of the home islands, it was apparent that even if every available and suitable airplane was converted for kamikaze service, there just weren't enough of them. The solution was to create a purpose-built kamikaze airplane, one that avoided the expense and complexity of a conventional airplane and included only what was needed for that one-way trip. The requirements were that the airplane be technically simple, easy to mass produce in workshops dispersed to remote locations and by unskilled workers. It had to be easy for pilots to fly with minimal training. They were trying to get the pilot training for kamikazes down to just 1 month, although due to fuel shortages it tended to run about 2 months. The training for kamikazes was terrible and ineffective anyway, but that's another story. The plane had to be made from minimal amounts of non-ferrous metals like aluminum, copper, brass, the valuable stuff. Wood and cheap steel would be the name of the game here. It had to be able to take off from poor forward airfields with its armament of one single bomb. The plane had to accept a number of different radial engines, basically whatever was available, in the 800 to 1300 horsepower range. As the plane wouldn't need to maneuver much or dogfight in any way, there were only 2 specific performance requirements listed: a top speed of 340 kilometers per hour, 211 miles an hour, with the bomb load, and a maximum dive speed of 515 kilometers per hour, that's 320 miles an hour. To meet these requirements, Nakajima came up with this airplane, the Ki-115. Both the Japanese Army Air Force and the Japanese Navy planned to use it. The two services gave them different names. The Army's word for it translates into sword, more or less, and the Navy's into wisteria blossom, which is this really beautiful plant that absolutely destroys fences. The power of the wisteria vines are amazing. It will turn a chain link fence into a pile of twisted junk, and I know this from personal experience. Anyway, whatever you call it, the Ki-115 was in every way designed to be a cheap, rapidly produced plane suitable for a one-way trip. No retractable landing gear was fitted. A lot of the complexity, weight, and expense of World War II airplanes was in the retractable landing gear, so leaving that out lowered cost, shortened production time, and increased performance. Thus, Nakajima went with a simple tube steel unit that was used for takeoff and then jettisoned for reuse by the next kamikaze who took off. Initially, the takeoff gear was literally made up of simple rigid tubes and no brakes were installed. There were a lot of accidents in testing, and eventually they did fit some drum-type brakes and primitive shock absorbers. Many pictures of Ki-115s show them without gear or with the gear folded underneath the airplane. Since they plan to reuse the gear, it stands to reason that they built more airplanes than takeoff gear. Side note, it appears that at least in some cases these planes were built in a factory that also built Ki-84 Franks. Both, of course, are Nakajima designs. The wings of the plane were all metal and aluminum, and that aluminum was at a premium. The wing loading was high by Japanese standards, but at 41 pounds per square foot, it's about the same as a typical Bf-109G or P-51D. Interestingly, the wing loading of a Ki-44 Tojo, also made by Nakajima, is in the same ballpark at 38 pounds per square foot. And the wing on the Tojo looks a lot like the one on the Ki-115. It's not the same, but there's a family resemblance. Initially, the planes didn't have flaps, but a series of takeoff accidents convinced them to add flaps, which is why the flaps you see in the picture appear to be afterthoughts. They are. The fuselage is where they really simplified the plane. It's made up of welded tube steel construction, like a children's playground set. Most sources say that the front was covered in aluminum and that the rear section of the fuselage was covered in very thin sheet steel. I'm not so sure about this. Now, there are not a lot of pictures of these planes, and to further add to the confusion, there were at least 3 versions of it. However, I don't see any differences in tarnishing or corrosion of the different sections of the fuselage in any of the pictures I can find. Apparently, there is one of these things at the Pima Air Museum in Arizona. Perhaps someone who works there can take a look and see what the fuselage of that example is covered in. I suspect that the idea was to cover the front in aluminum and everything aft of the cockpit in thin sheet steel, but I think in practice they just put on whatever they had. Thus, it's possible some planes have all aluminum fuselage skin or all steel. At least that's the way it looks to me in the few pictures we have of this airplane. The tail was made of wood, and the elevator, rudder, and ailerons were fabric covered, which was still quite common in 1945, even for high-performance airplanes. Most of the fuselage had a round, as opposed to oval, cross-section, and was a constant diameter for as long as possible to simplify design and construction. The motor mount configuration was set up to accept a variety of engines. I couldn't find specifics on just how they did this, but in practice, every Ki-115 was fitted with a Nakajima HA-115-2 with 1130 horsepower. I want to talk about this for just a moment, not the engine itself, but the name of the engine. As I start to cover Japanese stuff on this channel, this is starting to become important. The Japanese very typically had several different names for the exact same engine. This was a result of various factors. First of all, the Japanese Army Air Force and the Japanese Navy, they didn't really get along all that well, and they would have different designations for the same engine. The manufacturer would have a designation, and then there would be a customer designation. If the manufacturing of the engine was farmed out to another factory, that company would give it yet another designation. All this, plus there is something they later came up with called the unified designation. So it's not unusual to see 6 different designations for 6 functionally identical engines. The engine in the Ki-115 is basically the same engine used in some A6M0s, which was called the HA-35, the Sake, or NK-1, or by various other designations. The exact version used in most, if not all, Ki-115s was the Nakajima HA-115-2, which was apparently built or at least included key parts from Hatsudoki, which is the company that became Daihatsu. Nakajima, of course, became Subaru, a fact which surprises me because most Nakajima aircraft look great. Anyway, it's a decent but obsolete engine. 1130 horsepower wasn't much by this point of the war. It's spinning a 3-bladed constant-speed propeller, which was pretty standard stuff. There was no armament other than the bomb it was to deliver. The bomb was recessed into the fuselage. It was not in an internal bomb bay. There was no room for that. But only about half of the bomb was exposed to the slipstream, so it didn't add as much drag as you might think. It had an open cockpit, that certainly added drag, and that also makes it one of the last open cockpit warplanes. Now, as far as I know, this is the only cockpit photo of this plane from the period, and it's an incredibly simple airplane in there by World War II standards. The Ki-115 was a death trap, even in training. It's hard to know how much of that is due to the design, quality control, or very poorly trained pilots. The huge drawbacks of this design, and even the idea of kamikaze attacks, started to become apparent to the Japanese leadership. If you launched a huge raid with these airplanes against targets at sea, say 100 Ki-115s attacking a U.S. carrier group, if the Ki-115s failed to find the target, at a minimum, you just lost most, if not all of those planes because they would be wrecked when landing. Remember, no landing gear. Even if the returning kamikaze pilot makes a great landing and slides to a stop with minimal damage, he has now blocked the runway. You just can't practically recover, let alone recover and relaunch dozens of Ki-115s if they return to base. If the planes ditch at sea, say during the defense of Japan against U.S. invasion, or even during the defense of Okinawa, the Japanese had no way to recover those pilots, so there was a strong chance that any attempt to use these planes would suffer a near 100% loss rate of both the planes and the pilots. Now, if the planes did find the targets, the defending U.S. fighters would have shot them down in droves. Of course, in that case, maybe the Ki-115s would have caused more damage than they incurred, but at that point in the war, a typical kamikaze pilot flew his plane 5 times on a combat mission before he found a worthy target. That makes the idea of a plane you can't land, even a kamikaze airplane, really impractical. In fact, one kamikaze pilot of a conventional airplane flew 9 missions without finding a suitable target, although he was shot by his superiors on return from that 9th mission. The point is that if you have to send out 100 planes on a mission and maybe 5 hit their target, you have another 400 that were lost on missions where they failed to find targets. So the numbers just don't work out here, losing 500 planes and far worse, 500 pilots to score a few hits just wasn't a war-winning strategy. Now, before canceling the program, they did make several upgrades to the plane. Hence, there are really 3 versions of this thing: the Ki-115, the 115 Otsu, and the 115 HEI. The later versions really show the direction they were headed. The wing was improved and attachment points for rockets were added. These could be used to assist the airplane on takeoff or to increase speed on the plane's attack run. Most significantly, they altered the plane so it could now drop its bomb, which clearly indicates a change in philosophy from suicide attacks to mass raids with an aircraft that could possibly survive and bring the pilot back alive. Still, making it back without landing gear just isn't practical, and with all the losses in training and the obvious problems becoming clear, production stopped with just over 100 aircraft having been built. No Ki-115 ever reached combat units or flew a combat mission. In fact, the Allies had no idea this plane even existed until after the war. It's an interesting piece of history, and as the program used up resources, cost money, and lives without ever flying a mission, it was obviously a net loss for the Japanese. However, I think it's an interesting airplane, if for no other reason than because it shows that by mid-1945, when it was way too late, the Japanese finally started to understand the value of pilots and that they were not expendable. That's all for now. I hope you're having a great day. Goodbye.